possible in an earlier age. Okie dokie. All righty. Okay. Finally, ready to go. Rethinking Capitalism. A brief short bit here on uh, Alex Kalinikos, the late Alex Kalinikos. Has written some important books like Imperialism and the Global Economy. And there was an interview with him moderately recently with Tobias Phibbs. And it's, I think, it's Institute for Arts and Ideas or whatever. And I just think it's a useful introduction. And then we may look at uh, part of a thing of which I'll read his little comments. It is Damon Darren Darren Acemoglu is Power and Progress. Acemoglu, along with a couple of other guys, uh, won the Nobel Prize this year, um, and he was clearly on the short list for the last couple of years. And his work is on inequality, not necessarily from a heterodox perspective, but I think he's useful to listen to. He's mainly more about the kind of the tech side of it. But before we get to that, Tobias Phibbs asked a question of Kalinikos. Before we begin, how would you define capital and capitalism? Marx said that the distinctive thing about capitalism is that it is self-expanding. In other words, capitalism represents a situation in which money is able to grow to be more by the end of the cycle of investment than it was at the beginning. This seems like a mysterious process, but Marx argues that the solution to the problem of capital's self-expanding quality is the way it is invested in employing workers who create more value than is represented by their wages. This is the key to exploitation under capitalism. Marx is therefore arguing that capitalism is necessarily an exploitative system. From this perspective, capitalism is a social and economic system where capital prevails. This involves exploitation of wage labor, the appropriation of what Marx calls surplus value in the form of profits by the owners of capital. The second feature is competitive accumulation. In other words, the capitalist class is not a unified, homogeneous collective. They compete with each other, each trying to maximize their share of the surplus value. And this competition puts constant pressure on individual firms to reduce their costs. It compels them to accumulate. In other words, to invest in improving their methods of production. This is the driving force behind both the expansion of human productive powers under capitalism, but also the crises that Marx sees as a necessary feature of capitalism. And Tobias asks the second question, and the proposed solution is a democratically planned economy. Well, that's my theory. This is Kalinikos talking. Many people think you can counter the excesses of capitalism through different forms of regulation to eliminate the more obnoxious and destabilizing behavior of capitalism. But the record suggests that this isn't very realistic. Regulation doesn't work partly because corporate lobbying limits its effectiveness, and partly because the banks and hedge funds and so on have enormous incentives to bypass it. So the solution, in my view, is a systemic change, which would involve replacing capitalism with democratic planning. Tobias asks or comments, it's worth mentioning that capitalism isn't quite the anarchistic system of free markets that we sometimes imagine it to be. There is already a degree of economic planning. As Hajun Chang has shown, the state has always had a role in capitalist innovation. So, what would a democratically planned economy look like? And what would separate it from experiments in democratic capitalism that already take place? And so Kalinikos responds, you're absolutely right. There are different forms of planning under capitalism, but they tend to be partial and practically organized. That is, corporations make plans, states make plans, but overall, they do it in a hierarchical way that does not involve most people in the decisions that affect their lives. In addition, these plans affect only fragments of the system and are driven by vested interests. Planning under capitalism involves planning to compete more effectively. It does not abolish the competition that drives the system towards crises. It only modifies the particular form of that competition. Democratic planning, on the other hand, has two features. Firstly, it involves planning the economy as a whole. In principle, the allocation and use of resources in the global economy would all be included in planning. Secondly, the planning would all be democratically organized. In other words, it would radiate upwards from networks of consumers and producers who would negotiate among themselves about how best to use the resources that they control. Now, those are the key features of economic planning in the contemporary world. Tobias asks, the question of democracy is a fraught one. Is the belief that democratic planning will necessarily produce better social outcomes a statement of faith in people, or is there something else going on? Alex responds, well, the American colonies broke away from Britain on the basis of no taxation without representation. The underlying principle is that people should have a share in the decisions that affect their lives. Democratic planning is a radical extension of that principle. I mean, are the outcomes likely to be better than under the existing system? Well, there's absolutely no guarantee that they will be, because majorities can make mistakes just like the boards of directors of investment banks. However, democratic planning would enable a different range of alternatives to be considered, and according to different criteria. One of the problems with capitalism is the way in which economic calculations involve transforming everything into abstract quantities of money. But those things that are important for us to value are not necessarily translatable into those kind of quantities. This is reflected in the kind of difficulties that governments and corporations have when they try to take into account the environmental impact of particular decisions. One of the important changes that democratic planning would involve would therefore be a shift to being guided by a much more qualitative set of considerations than the very narrow quantitative dimensions of money and profit that we find under the current system. Tobias asked, I think this is the last question, this is a radical transformation of society, but it still seems to have elements of continuity with the current way that society is organized. Marx famously advocated that a socialist society would be one in which nobody has one specific sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes. In the 21st century, is this totally utopian? Could breaking down the division of labor feasibly be part of a future division of society? Alex responds, the important continuities are the concept of economic efficiency, even if the criteria are more complex, and a concern for democracy, which, of course, is one of the standing values of our own societies. Democratic planning involves extending democratic principles to the economy where they don't currently reign. That passage you cite from the German ideology is definitely tongue-in-cheek, but even if Marx did mean it seriously, it's not really defensible, because you cannot run a complex economy governed by the criteria of economic efficiency and just allow people to do whatever they like. There would have to be a degree of specialization and long-term commitment to particular activities. The difference would be that people would have a much broader choice about what they can do than most people have at the present time. And if people wanted to change, then there'd be greater opportunities to retrain than currently exist in contemporary capitalism. But I don't think one can simply abolish the division of labor. It's a prerequisite of any economy. A significant degree of specialization is needed, but it need be the kind of prison that it tends to be in contemporary society. Tobias asks again, now, one anarchist critique is that if you have a group of experts, they're likely to be leading the transformation for society. How do you avoid the crystallization of experts as a distinct class? Well, it's a mistake to think, Alex responds, it's a mistake to think that we're ruled by experts. Notoriously, the people in charge of banks don't understand the complex financial instruments they make money from. In the Soviet Union, what happened was not that the managers took control, but that the political bureaucrats took control. Inequality is not a consequence of the need for experts. In addition, a generalized high degree of education will make it less likely for a narrow group of people to derive exceptional power, except simply by monopolizing information or a particular skill. The need for experts is not the problem. The experience of the Soviet Union shows that we need to worry about the possible sources of re-centralization of power. What causes that is not expertise. It has to do with scarcity and competition. So Tobias asks, what are the realistic chances of transforming society and democratizing the economy in the ways you suggest? At this point in time, they don't look very high because the left in all its varieties is weak and discredited. We've just seen a spectacular crumbling of the leftist government in Greece. This is from a while back. But one has to take a long historical perspective. The left has been much stronger in my own lifetime, and I don't see why there can't be the reemergence of a much stronger left that can be the bearer of the kind of political and economic vision that I'm talking about. And so that's the end of a question and answer conversation with Alex Kalanikos. Here's his farewell lecture. I think is his last public lecture, and talks about the new age of catastrophe. And it's pretty clear that some folks, as we get older, we begin to see, whatever chaos ahead. This is the introduction to. There's another book launch. Darren Acemoglu's Power and Progress. The book examines both historical and contemporary evidence to explore the relationship between technological breakthroughs and social and economic progress. While one would assume advancements in technology over history would automatically result in improvements in broader society, it was often not the case. Even from the European Middle Ages, with breakthroughs in agriculture, for example, windmills for grain production, to the cotton mill in southern United States during the pre-Civil War era to modern times, with the proliferation of digital technologies, the value generated from technological breakthroughs did not often go to average citizenry, but to a small number of ruling elites. According to Acemoglu and Johnson, the absence of new tasks created by technology designed solely to automate human work will not result in increased labor productivity. Rather, it will simply disclose or dislocate it will simply dislocate the human workforce and redirect value from labor to capital. On the other hand, technologies that not only enhance efficiency but also generate new tasks for human workers have a dual advantage of increasing marginal productivity and yielding more positive effects on society as a whole. To illustrate this point, Acemoglu gave the example of Ford Motor Company's mechanization of the automotive factory, which at the same time as automating work created new tasks for its workers. These technologies, he said, focused not on replacing humans with machine intelligence, but enabling them with technologies that had the characteristics of machine usefulness. As breakthroughs in generative artificial intelligence, AI, and large language models thrust the world into the era of AI, more should be done to ensure a bright future where these technologies do not serve to further displace labor, but instead enable a more productive workforce. Change the narrative. That's another one of the things that should be done. A change in the global narrative on these technologies is needed. A narrative that moves from the blind techno-optimism fixated on replacing humans with machines to one framed around empowering and enabling humans to be more productive. Create countervailing powers, given the control of a few private sector corporations over technologies like AI, the presence of countervailing powers, such as regulatory institutions and trade unions, may be needed to ensure that citizens and workers' voices are heard and interests taken into account. Gee, democracy. redirect technological change to enhance human capabilities. New technologies, particularly AI, should not focus solely on automating tasks previously done by humans and instead seek to empower and enable workforces to be more productive. For AI, this could mean serving to enhance human decision making by filtering and curating information. While redirecting technological innovation for the benefits of society sounds like a daunting task, Acemoglu cited the success of government subsidies and incentives in driving down the cost of renewable energy as a recent example. Here's a little brief conversation with him. We'll see how brief and how far we can go with this. I won't play all of this. You can listen to this at your leisure.
So welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure on behalf of the London Business School and the Wheeler Institute for Business and Development to welcome you all here. We're extremely happy that you managed to make it. I'm Elias Papaioannou, and alongside my colleague Rajesh Chandy, I'm the academic co-director of the Wheeler Institute for Business and Development, established with a very generous donation of Tony and Maureen Wheeler, who you all know. Not only they are great alumni of the school, but they were the founders of Lonely Planet, who have given us so many nice memories of across the world. So we are extremely pleased today to have with us Daron Acemoglu, Professor of Economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. You all know his work, which I would say cover every single aspect of economics and social sciences more generally. Daron has done path-breaking research on the role of institutions, on long-run development, on the role of colonization, which is much closer to my research interest, work fundamental on how to think about technology, which will also be at the core of our discussion today, skill bias, technical change, thinking more recently about network, the spread of misinformation, which is another very vibrant area of his academic kind of research. It will take ages for me to go over his very important contributions, but what I want to stress is that we consider Daron as being one of us. London Business School decorated Daron with an honorary doctorate a couple of years ago. So we're pleased to have him part of the London Business School community. Let me also further stress that Daron has taught at the PhD program at the London Business School many years ago. This was the time that, I was not teaching. You had like way better teachers, at least for the PhD students here. And not only that, but Daron is doing very interesting work with my great colleague Andrew Scott, with Ahmed Tahoun. We always discuss about some ideas, but I never find time to work with him. So we consider Daron as being one of us. Now, Daron will present his recent book that has been very recently released both here and in the US, Power and Progress. And we have asked Andrew Scott, my great friend and colleague, to lead the discussion after Daron gives an overview of his ideas. Andrew and Daron, I think the very first papers that they published, those guys were written together. So Andrew now has moved from doing work on macro on doing much more interesting work about longevity. He has written a very important book on the 100-year life together with our other great colleague, Linda Gratton. And now he's working on a recent book, on a forthcoming book that will appear, what I just heard, on March next year on the longevity imperative. So Daron, thanks big time for picking London Business School to give the presentation of your very fascinating book in London. We look forward, and thanks big time for being with us.
Thank you very much. Let me find the clicker. Okay, here. Okay, wonderful. First of all, thank you, Elias, for that wonderful introduction. It's really a true pleasure to be here. As Elias said, this is a wonderful institution, which I see as part of my homes. And this is my first public talk about the book, actually. Well, live public talk. I gave one public one for virtually. So I couldn't think of a better place to get started on it. So this is the book, the US edition. So I should have put the UK edition, but these colors match the background that we have for the presentation. So Simon and I are motivated by something that is very much in the minds of people. There is, in equal part, mesmerization and excitement about new breakthroughs in AI, generative AI, and other technologies. People are right to be excited, and they're right to be concerned. But often unasked in this debate are two critical questions. Who controls the path of these technologies, and who will benefit? And these questions are even more important in the age of AI because they are very transformative in both their distributional and societal effects. And they are being rolled out very rapidly. Their impact will be completely entangled with the institutions that we have, the direction in which they are developed, and the visions that guide them. And by visions, what Simon and I mean is, what are the priorities of the powerful actors who have an oversized impact on the direction of these technologies? And in some ways, oops, went too much. In some ways, we have been here before. I'm going to argue that there's a lot to learn from history, both in terms of who benefits, who loses, the direction of technology, but also in terms of visions. This gentleman, Ferdinand de Lesseps, was one of the most important entrepreneurs and technological visionaries of the second half of the 19th century. He did something that many people thought was impossible, which is to cajole and convince many politicians in Egypt, in France, as well as thousands of investors to invest in the Suez Canal, especially when people said that what he had in mind was impossible and futile because he thought that he could build a sea-level canal without locks. And that was very important for him because of the second part of his vision, that there would be an enormous increase in oceanic shipping, and locks at Suez would slow down traffic, and that was unacceptable because trade was very important to enrich everybody. And then the other part of his vision was that he was a complete techno-optimist. He used to say, men of genius would rise to solve all problems, which meant for him that he could try impossible things and technological advances would sort things out. And at Suez, miraculously perhaps, he turned out to be right. The canal was built, oceanic shipping exploded, technological advances happened just at the right time to make his schemes work, both in terms of digging the canal and also the sort of the shipping technologies. It was a huge success, and he was named Le Grand Français, the great Frenchman. Of course, people ignore the fact that he used coerced labor, and those people didn't seem to benefit. Everybody benefited. His vision turned into hubris. He pushed exactly the same things in Panama, and it was a complete failure. The conditions were different, both in terms of the topography. A canal, if the form that he thought could be built, was impossible, and in terms of the local conditions, disease environment, more than 22,000 people died, including several thousand of the most promising French engineers who he brought with him. Thousands of people were ruined. This is not completely foreign to us. Success breeds self-confidence in visions, and hubris makes you ignore the consequences. But perhaps we don't have to worry about it. If technological change is such a potent force that it will bring everybody together, as long as progress happens, as long as advances take place, perhaps those issues of visionaries, hubris, the competition between them are second order. Part of the reason why Simon and I wrote the book is because we want to argue against a blind techno-optimism, that all the costs are transitional, and ultimately, through an automatic process, everybody would benefit. Why would that be true? Well, let's think about it. In fact, my profession of economics has a version of that techno-optimism. Simon and I call it productivity bandwagon. We had to give it a name because it's so common in economics that it doesn't actually have a name. And it goes something like this. Technology improves, average productivity increases, so workers' output relative to workers goes up. As a result, firms rush out to hire more workers, that pushes up labor demand increase translates into higher wages and employment. So that's really central for shared prosperity. Because if we don't increase wages, we're not going to be able to pull everybody together. So the productivity bandwagon says that there are powerful forces towards that type of sharing. Now the question is whether the productivity bandwagon is right. Well, Simon and I argue that it could be right, but it's not an unconditional automatic process. It requires the right type of technology and the right type of institutions. So here is one amazing breakthrough. The dark ages were not dark in terms of technology. There were many important breakthroughs in terms of production techniques, crops, organization of production. Some of the most important ones were related to windmills that increased labor productivity by several-fold. But who benefited? Not the peasants. Actually, peasant incomes, real incomes, probably fell during the rollout of the windmills. Instead, all of the surplus was captured by the nobility and abbots who monopolized these new production techniques. So what you do with the surplus that you generate matters. It need not be shared. This is Eli Whitney's cotton gin. This is even more sweeping in terms of its implications than the medieval windmills, perhaps. It, at one fell swoop, turned the south of the United States into the most major cotton producer in the world. The United States became the largest exporter of cotton, which fueled the British Industrial Revolution by enabling varieties of the southern cotton to be ginned and the fiber to be separated from the yarn, and from the plant, and many people became fabulously wealthy, but not the workers. The workers were the enslaved people who suffered much worse conditions as a result of the cotton gin because they were pushed down to the further south and made to work much harder, much longer hours under much harsher conditions because plantations were now so profitable that they had to be pressed down further. The Industrial Revolution, there is no doubt, there isn't even any question or debate that we today are beneficiaries of the process that started in the 18th century. The Industrial Revolution, the application of industrial technologies, and then later scientific methods. We are much more comfortable, much healthier, and much more prosperous. So you might think that is exhibit number one for techno-optimism. Well, not quite. That process wasn't automatic either, and in fact, the first 80, 90 years of the British Industrial Revolution did not bring much comfort or improvements to the working people. First of all, the production technologies were not of the sort that would make the productivity bandwagon work. These were mechanized, automated machinery, for example, in spinning and then in weaving, which displaced workers that used to be highly paid laborers, skilled artisans, often to be substituted by the labor of women and children and machinery, and wages did not increase. In fact, real wages may have fallen because although real incomes were more or less constant for this period, working hours increased by as much as 20%. And working conditions worsened as well. So why does automation, machinery that substitutes workers' labor without doing anything else, make the productivity bandwagon disentangle? Well, think of the productivity bandwagon. Average productivity increases, and employers rush to hire more labor. But if you're doing automation, imagine an amazing factory that has no workers and produces a lot of output. Well, why should that make employers want to hire more labor? So the presumption that somehow there is a relationship between average productivity and what employers want to pay labor is actually faulty. The relationship is basic economics between marginal productivity and what employers want, the contribution of labor. And often in economics and in public discussions, we somehow equate average productivity with marginal productivity, but when there is automation, the two are very different. But it wasn't just that. It was also the whole factory system. This is the panopticon, famous from Michel Foucault and the Guardians of the Galaxy. It never became a reality, but it was an aspiration for British entrepreneurs. Much tougher monitoring, because they had to get the last ounce of work from their workers and make them work very hard. And this was really, really hard work for hour after hour. Huge amount of noise, very, very dangerous work with no autonomy. And the only way they could do it is by hard, disciplined monitoring of the workers. At the same time, workers were filled into cities where disease, pollution were rampant, life expectancy dropped precipitously during the same time. So the conditions of the working classes did not improve, not at all, until the second half of the 19th century. So was that an automatic process? No. That was a result of a redirection of technological change towards things that increased labor productivity, so the marginal productivity, the contribution of workers by creating new tasks, and through a process of institutional change, democratization, much better bureaucratic control of pollution, public infrastructure, public sanitation, and trade unions, which were completely illegal during the period where employers were pressing down hard on workers, became legal and started for asking better conditions, higher wages, also having a say in how factories were run. But we can get a better sense of all of these things by also thinking about the period of the 20th century. The 20th century, you might say, is different, right? Well, right and wrong. In the 20th century, as a continuation of things that started in the second half of the 19th century and the early to 1900s, we had periods of very, very rapid growth that were shared. So here you see one part of it from this graph, which summarizes about 60 years of wage structure changes in the United States by plotting the evolution of real wages for workers by 10 demographic groups. Men and women and 5 education groups. In red, you have workers without a high school degree, all the way up to blue, dark blue, workers with a college degree. What you see from 1963 onwards in this figure, but the same pattern with different data you can show going back to the 1949, is a period of remarkably shared prosperity. The fact that all 10 of these curves are on top of each other and they are rising rapidly indicates that real wages of all these demographic groups are growing in tandem. And that growth rate is very fast. It's about 2.5% a year in real terms. So people are becoming, regardless of their education level, they're becoming richer by 2.5% a year, every year. That's more or less the productivity growth. So the productivity growth is being very broadly shared. And in fact, if you go back to the 40s and the 50s, you see low education groups actually gaining a little bit more than high education groups. But then you see something very reminiscent of the medieval period or the first stage of industrial revolution, a much more unshared pattern of prosperity. From around 1980 onwards, you see that these curves are fanning out, much greater levels of inequality, huge levels of inequality, and even more concerningly, real incomes of low education groups, the red high school dropouts, the green high school graduates, are actually going down. So there is a fairly rapid process in which real incomes of certain groups are being lost in the United States. This does not look like shared prosperity, unless you have a very strange view of shared prosperity. And it's sort of concerning when we are told that this is the best period and we are in the midst of the most amazing discoveries. This is not unique to the United States. Inequality has increased in much of the world, if you look at, for example, an omnibus measure like the Gini coefficient, and real earnings have been stagnant in most countries for low education groups. The difference is US has low real minimum wages, very little unionization, very weak norms against workplace inequality. So you've seen this much more pronounced in the United States than in many other countries, but the patterns are the same. So we really need to understand how the period of shared prosperity in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s was realized and why we lost it. And then we have to think about whether AI is going to intensify or rectify these trends. So here is how the two pillars of prosperity started coming together, for example, in the US in Ford factories. This is a picture very representative of what was going on in much of manufacturing, but led by companies like the Ford Motor Company. Introduction of electricity, new machinery, the assembly line, but at the same time, you see workers are centrally involved in the production process. At the same time as new machinery was being introduced, new jobs, new tasks were being created for workers, and many of them actually required more skills, more training. And what you don't see here is that there was a whole engineering, repairs, inspection, design, and back office white collar. And that created a lot of productivity growth, and it created a lot of jobs that was central. This was new tasks creating greater marginal productivity of labor so that employers have a reason to pay for it. At the same time, not led by Ford, who was very anti-union, workers became more organized so that they actually took a fair share of the increase in productivity that they brought. So for example, this is the United Auto Workers sit-down strike in 1937, which was a turning point in much better organization of labor. But things started going wrong with the digital age. Why did they do so? So this is a car factory of the 2000s. Much greater involvement of robots. Great, but where are the workers? So we've used digital technologies to automate, just like the spinning and weaving machinery, but not create new tasks. So workers became much more dispensable. Consequences of that automation, you can see from, for example, from this chart from my work with Pasquale Restrepo, I'm again showing things for demographic groups, but now not 10, but a little bit more detailed so that you can get a richer picture. So these are demographic groups distinguished by gender, education, experience, and ethnicity in the United States. The size of the circle is the size of the group. The color coding, again, tells you their education level so that you see what happens to low education groups. And on the horizontal axis, now you have a summary measure, the real wage change from 1980 to 2016. So you see the zero there. Many of these demographic groups are below zero. They are the ones that have lost real wages. In their real earnings have actually gone down. And what you see on the horizontal axis is a major cause of that. On the horizontal axis, we have our estimate of what fraction of the tasks that this group used to perform in 1980 have since been automated. And what you see is that those groups that have lost out in terms of real earnings are precisely those whose tasks have been automated and no new tasks have been for them have been created. At the same time, the fair sharing of the gains has also evaporated. This followed institutional and vision changes. Vision matters both for technology and for what corporations do. What are the things that we prioritize? Milton Friedman was not the only one. Perhaps things were taking shape even before him, but he crystallized a view of what corporations should be about. The social responsibility of businesses to increase its profits, care about social shareholders and nothing else, which corporations took to mean we can press down on workers, cut wages, cut employment, automate work in order to pass more gains to shareholders. Somebody could have objected to it. Civil society, it didn't. Workers, well, they were getting weak at the same time. Manufacturing was in a decline in the United States that weakened unions, but also, for example, turning points such as the professional air traffic controllers strike in 1981 when Ronald Reagan fired them all and encouraged private companies to do the same against their striking workers as well. Of course, this is all history. That's computers, that's robots, that's numerically controlled machinery, and we are now in the age of AI. Perhaps AI is going to be all different. In some sense, there is a possibility of that difference. AI is a very broad general purpose technology, a broad platform on which we can build many things. So it becomes very important what we use AI for, and again, the institutional setup and the visions that guide it are going to be important. Ever since the beginning of computer science and AI, there have been two visions that compete for it. But we hear much more about one of them today. One of them that goes back to Alan Turing, although it predates him a little bit, and then became amplified by many early AI researchers in the 1960s, is based on machine intelligence. Autonomous machines that become as intelligent as human. They do human-like tasks like, for example, reaching human parity. The Turing test or the imitation game is one encapsulation of that principle. But why do we want machines to be intelligent? Why do we want them to be autonomous? Instead, some other scientists such as Norbert Wiener at MIT, Douglas Engelbart, J.C.R. Licklider, articulated a different vision. Simon and I'll call it machine usefulness. We should have machines be useful to humans. They may automate work, that's fine if it's useful to humans. But machine intelligence and autonomy, which of course immediately translates into data collection, monitoring, surveillance, and automation, is not the objective. And many of the important breakthroughs in computer science and computer applicability actually came out of this machine vision, machine usefulness perspective. Hypertext, the mouse, they were all inventions that Douglas Engelbart himself did, and his students further performed these innovations. But we have abandoned that, or it's become marginal. Instead, we have gone all into machine intelligence. Machine intelligence encourages a lot of automation. What Pasquale Restrepo and I, Simon Johnson and I have called excessive automation. Because automation is so-so. It doesn't improve productivity all that much. All these people would have been happier if there was a competent cashier there instead of them waiting for a malfunctioning self-checkout kiosk. Even if the self-checkout kiosk works, even if automation works, the changes are not revolutionary. In fact, you see that in the productivity statistics. We are going through some of the slowest periods of productivity because increasing productivity by automation is very hard. Imagine you automate 5% of tasks in the economy. That's a huge number of tasks. If that's the only thing you do, machines need to be so much better than humans for that 5% to generate, to be the engine of, say, 1% productivity growth at the aggregate. It's much better to actually make workers more productive. This is not going to get you big productivity growth. So the machine intelligence vision is not just inequality boosting, it's actually not that good for productivity. Now, of course, we weren't sure about this, so we asked ChatGPT, will generative AI reverse these long-term trends of widening inequality? And ChatGPT said, perhaps, but probably not. It's not a magic solution. If generative AI is used to replace workers instead of supporting them, it could have negative consequences. We agree with ChatGPT. It's not just work. The whole nature of communication, human cognition, and democratic discourse, political participation are being transformed. The current vision of AI that's based on machine intelligence and autonomy also encourages massive amounts of data collection. First, it is hungry for data, and second, humans are secondary because we're trying to train these wonderful machines, so it's okay to generate a lot of data. That leads to centralization of data in the context of social media and all of the anti-democratic consequences of that, or things like the social credit system in China. The implications for the emerging world are often left on the side. But actually, there are first-order implications for the emerging world. In the 1960s and 70s, a group of economists such as Francis Stewart and others pushed an idea of appropriate or inappropriate technologies. Technologies developed in the scientific frontier may be inappropriate for the conditions in the developing world and would not generate prosperity. They emphasize, for example, large companies and excessive capital intensity. But actually, we may be faced with the mother of all inappropriate technologies because AI is replacing tasks that are actually at the heart of the economies in many emerging economies. Routine, basic production tasks in both manufacturing and services, and you see them disappearing during the age of automation and AI. What can we do? Well, the first thing you have to do is we have to change the narrative. You see how the narrative of machine intelligence is quite complementary with an idea that we have algorithms designed by geniuses who are good shepherds of technology, and the rest of society will gratefully take them. I think that needs to change. Democratic control of technology is central, so we need a change of narrative, and that change of narrative has to start, in our opinion, by recognizing that you need this more pro-human direction of labor, of the technology that helps labor, that creates new tasks for labor, and also it needs to be embedded in an institution that empowers, cries, voice from labor and broader democratic citizenry. That cannot be done without institutional changes countervailing powers. Ralph Nader, for example, showed, he's now much criticized, and there are reasons to criticize him perhaps, but he showed how civil society organizations can be put together in a very organic way for people to have their voices heard. Today, we don't have natural ways of doing that, but people are struggling with it. For example, work conditions in the Amazon warehouses are not very good, and service workers cannot normally unionize very easily, but people are trying, and there have been some successes. Are those the right models? We don't know, but I think we have to try. We also have to redirect technological change. If Simon and my emphasis that the direction of technology, whether it is purely automating or it is also creating new tasks for workers at the same time as it is automating, is central, then redirecting technological change is important. Many other computer scientists and leaders, even after Engelbart and J.C.R. Licklider's academic work, among the activists were pushing for this. For example, Ted Nelson. The public does not have to take what's being dished out, computer power to the people. He actually thought that computers were going to be a particularly liberating technology, empower workers, empower citizens, and he railed against the control of computers by corporations such as IBM. Of course, Ted Nelson's ideas didn't work out. IBM became stronger, Microsoft became a company that centralized all the software and then enabled office automation. But I think there's nothing in the nature of these technologies, and AI, by acting as a better filter of information, better way of curating information for decision makers, creating new tasks for nurses, teachers, creators, all as well as manual workers such as electricians, it can actually be a conduit for creating new tasks and the foundations of shared prosperity. Now, this might all seem like wishful thinking. You might say, well, the government or even democratic process cannot redirect technological change. But actually, there are plenty of examples. Most recently, we see that, for example, in the area of renewables. Even though the problem of climate change has been known and not much has been done about it, once people started agitating and demanded action from companies, and a few governments introduced carbon taxes, several more governments introduced subsidies for new green technologies, there has been a tremendous
Let me just stop right there because I've gone over time or completed my hour anyway, and ask if there are any questions or comments or at all.
I think he's fascinating.
Yes, he didn't mention, there are buzzwords in there that could have been mentioned, slavery, other matters, but they didn't get mentioned. So, but
Well,
he's quite cool. Go ahead.
He did mention the slavery. He gave the example of the cotton gin not helping the situation of the workers. In fact, made it worse.
Yeah, he didn't talk enough about the people who are actually doing the whatever.
I could also recommend that he's been on Pitchfork Economics several times. Hanauer and Goldie are really enamored with his work. They think he's brilliant. So
Hey,
yeah, he's really quite astonishing. And the fact that he won the Nobel this year,
yes.
that's a departure. That's a good thing.
Oh yeah, yeah. But he'd been on the short list or on the mentions of who's up for the Nobel for the last couple of years.
Hmm. That's really good. I hope that, I don't know, maybe I think Wolf's time is come and gone because he's not really doing real economic work anymore.
No, no.
So, but he is, and that's an impressive thing. So thank you for that. I really
Uh-huh.
enjoyed that.
And the full speech and a conversation is on the web page, so people can take advantage of that, I hope. I'll thank you for your attention. We can, and I will shut off the live stream. There are other things that I want to talk about, of course, but we have no time. Let me mention that for those who came in later, that there is a new, even though the guy is dead, his last book. I mean, he died in 2018, but the same person that Henry Hakamaki was translating the book on Stalin. Um, there's a subsequent book on Western Marxism that has just been published, put together by a bunch of folks. I think Monthly Review is offering it up, and I've included connections to that. And I probably am going to start, once I start working on it, be talking about that for the next week or so. Let me mention in other contexts, the concluding lecture I think is scheduled for the 9th for Andy Higginbottom's coverage of Volume 2 of Marx's Capital, Volume 2. And so we'll be discussing that next week as well. And it all fits together, I hope. So let me thank you for your attention. And we leave you back to, and I'll shut off the live stream.